Oops, there it isn't. Name of the game is Game Boy Works episode 118. To the best of my knowledge and research, In Your Face is the first portable basketball game ever produced. I mean, sure, yeah, you had the LED-based handheld toys of the 70s. I used to own one designed to look like a flattened basketball. But in terms of proper video games, In Your Face is it. Now bear in mind that by this point in history, there are two other handhelds competing with Game Boy. The Atari Lynx shipped shortly after the Game Boy hit the US in 1989, of course, and I let the Sega Game Gear's Japanese debut in October 1990 pass without comment. Many of the Game Boy's notable accomplishments stem from its being the first ever cartridge-based handheld console to achieve any sort of traction, but we will from time to time begin seeing Game Boy firsts that are no longer handheld gaming firsts. That said, no one had really thought to bring basketball into portable form until Jaleco stepped up. Their solution was simply to convert an NES game that they just kinda had laying around. Hoops. Hoops had been a reasonably popular NES release, and in Japan, Jaleco branded it as part of the same franchise that gave us Bases Loaded, the Moero, or Burning as in Fired Up, sports line. And just as Bases Loaded had fired up the public's imagination with its unique perspective on the baseball diamond, the Game Boy version notwithstanding, Hoops took an atypical approach to basketball too. Where most basketball video games of this era presented the full court in a horizontal format that scrolled left to right, Hoops took a page from one of the earliest basketball games ever made, EA's one-on-one Dr. J versus Larry Bird. As with that game, Hoops used a half-court format where two players challenged one another to snag the ball and sink the most baskets. Hoops stood out in the presence of the NES's more traditional takes on basketball, and its fast-paced style and showy dunks allowed it to stand toe-to-toe with Konami's perennial crowd-pleaser, Double Dribble. By all measures, Hoops for Game Boy should have been, a slam dunk. Not only did it essentially reproduce the entirety of Hoops on Game Boy, it didn't have to fend off competition from other basketball sims. It had, as it were, the court to itself. And yet there was no Hoops for Game Boy. Instead we have In Your Face, which is Hoops for Game Boy but under a different name. Why the name change? Perhaps not to sully the reputation of the source material. In Your Face feels almost like a taunt from the publisher. You just blew $30 on this game, in your face. Well, maybe that's an overstatement, but In Your Face is a terribly slight game that isn't especially good at doing what it does. You have your pick of two different modes here, 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, and you can either play solo against the impossibly deft AI, or against a friend who may or may not be deaf. You can choose to play to one of several time targets or score targets, and, well, that's In Your Face. The entire game takes place in one half of a court with a hoop that both players aim to hit at the top center of the screen. Well, top center, sort of. This being limited to Game Boy's resolution, the court doesn't actually fit onto the screen. The NES game had a small amount of vertical scrolling as you moved toward or away from the goal, but here the screen scrolls a lot more. It's not really a big deal since the action is so localized to the ball and the 2 or 4 players vying for it, but it still feels like a compromise. There's not really much to this game. You take possession of the ball, dribble up to the goal, and try to sink a basket. The controls can be a little confusing at first, as shooting is a 2-step process. You press the action button once to jump, and then again to release. And if you just tap it once, you'll be penalized for traveling and lose possession of the ball. If you go for an up-close shot, you'll see a brief double dribble style cutscene, complete with a swish for a completed dunk, or a grating error sound for a failed attempt. Players take turns shooting until time runs out, or until one player hits the target score. And that's it. And honestly, that would probably be fine, except that unlike Hoops, In Your Face kinda plays like crap. The controls are mushy and unresponsive. The steal button almost never works against the AI player, though of course the AI, as always, has no trouble stealing from you. More annoyingly, the shoot button frequently fails to respond at all. You'll go up for a shot and nothing will happen. Initially I thought this might be because you need to take the ball to the half court or something, but that doesn't seem to factor in. It's just a game with sluggish, unresponsive controls. Just the thing you want in a fast-paced sports sim, really. So far as I can tell, In Your Face was never released in Japan, but in both the US and Europe it had the portable basketball genre to itself for a year. Konami would release a full-scale conversion of Double Dribble in December 1991. And that's kind of the nutshell summation of many genres on Game Boy for large swaths of the system's existence. It's not great, but what else was there? Like play-action football, In Your Face is another just muddling by of portable sports. It wasn't great, but unless you wanted to dig up one of those old LED games, it was your only real option. After an onslaught of forgettable Western Game Boy releases, it's nice to get back to forgettable Japanese releases, and one that speaks to the central Game Boy mission statement. That's right, it's a puzzle game. And this is one that plays a lot better than the last one we saw, the intriguing but infuriating Go-Go Tank. This one is much lower key, involving no military bombardments, gun emplacements, or independently minded idiots badly driving a tank. Instead, the entire premise is right there in the title. Koro is a Japanese onomatopoeia for rolling, and dice is a Japanese transliteration of dice. You control a set of dice, well actually just a die, that you need to roll through a maze, attempting to guide it to a target point. Your die rolls while linked in unison with a cursor that directs the die's motion. Between obstacles and targets-based placement, the challenge of the game comes in maneuvering the die to land on the goal. Reaching the target requires you to make use of the environment to manipulate the die while holding a fixed position with a cursor. It's difficult to explain in words, but in short, think back to the puzzles in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, where you have to take out or circumnavigate enemies who move relative to your own actions. Here, as there, impeding the die's movement by getting it caught up in scenery is a key tactic for success. On its own, this wouldn't necessarily be so tough. However, these are dice we're talking about, so the matter of face value comes into play. It's not simply enough to guide the die to the goal. The die also needs to be showing the value depicted on the target square. That is, if the goal shows a single dot, the die can't roll onto it unless it's showing its one face up. As the die rolls through the mazes, it reveals its different faces as you'd expect. This adds an extra element of complexity to your maneuvers. Physics dictates that your die is always going to display the same face in a given space as it rolls, which is where special tiles in the maze come into play. For example, an arrow tile will push your die forward without rolling it. A spring tile will cause your die to tumble through the air and reveal a different face when it lands. It's a pretty low-stress idea for a puzzle game, though playing at the highest difficulty level can be pretty vexing. An amiable puzzler with a leisurely pace and simple graphics that read well on Game Boy's screen is something we haven't really seen in a while, which is a shame because the platform really is well suited to this sort of thing. As for who we can thank for this pleasant and fairly inventive little puzzler, the developer credited for Koro Dice is A-Wave, a Japanese studio for whom this was their second release. You will probably not be surprised to learn that no real information about the studio exists on the English language internet. Again, Koro Dice appears to have been their sophomore project, so it was likely a newly established company. The company held on throughout most of the 90s, publishing a few Game Boy titles at the beginning, but eventually settling on fishing sims before vanishing. Their most notable years were right in the middle, as the subcontractors behind the well-regarded Sega CD conversion of Final Fight and a few other notable releases like Super Darius. For Koro Dice and a few other early releases, A-Wave worked under the banner of King Records. As with Pony Canyon, Meldak, Victor, Epic Sony, and probably a few others I'm forgetting, King Records was and is a music label that decided for a while that it should also publish video games. King was just getting started here, but the company would go on to have a decent 15-year run as a publisher up through the GBA era, including an Evangelion MAHJONG game that provides the Game Boy Works outro theme. King is still around and probably is most notable for being the label behind AKB48, the ever-changing idol supergroup that's like a cross between Menudo, The Polyphonic Spree, and To Catch a Predator. Koro Dice never came to the US, which is a shame. It's charming and just a bit mentally taxing, a pleasant pick-up-and-play experience. It doesn't require any language skills though, so if you ever find yourself stranded in December 1990 with nothing but a Game Boy and access to an international library of new game releases, you could definitely do worse than Koro Dice. Next up on Game Boy Works, both time and intellectual properties collapse into a singularity as Double Dragon returns, except not really.